Hello, this is Mark Lieberman, the host of the show The World According to Mark, brought to you through WPVM LP in Asheville, North Carolina, 103.7 on your dial and streaming globally on WPVMFM.org. Today, we're going to talk about a quote burning issue. You'll get the pun on that in a second. I have two distinguished journalists. One is Nadia Sussman, who is a video journalist at ProPublica, who has done a lot of investigative documentaries and visual stories. And Lulu Ramadan, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, who is both an investigative reporter at the Seattle Times and a distinguished fellow with ProPublica's local reporting network. Thanks to Nadia and Lulu for being on the show today.
Thank you for having us.
So we're doing a bi-coastal interview, and we're talking about what I call a burning issue. So here's how this came about. I read an article that Nadia Sussman had on ProPublica on the network, and it had something to do with pollution problems and health problems associated with burning of fields where sugarcane was grown, and focused on successful efforts, it would appear, in Brazil, where which is a large sugar producing country, which had transformed its agricultural harvesting process from one which depended upon burning fields during certain months to allow harvesting to take place easier and potentially less expensively, but they had converted their operations. Whereas in the United States, where we have an active sugar cane agricultural industry that is centered probably in multiple states, but in Florida in particular, they're still using that older method, and to the detriment, presumably, of people who live in and around the area, who work in the area, who breathe the air in that area. And the question that Nadia's piece raised for me is, well, why is that? Why would a country like Brazil, which doesn't exactly have a sterling reputation on a lot of environmental fronts, including destruction of the rainforest in the Amazon, why would they be so much more out in front on an ecological and health issue than the United States? So I brought Nadia in, and then Nadia brought to me Lulu, who has done reporting specifically on what's happening in Florida and what's not happening. So I'm happy to have both of you on. Why don't we start off with, I don't know, Lulu, you want to go first and talk about what is happening in Florida? There's a legal action pending, and this issue has been debated and controversial for several years, but we're seeing potentially some light at the end of the tunnel, so to speak.
Yeah, sure. So the reporting on the topic of sugarcane burning in Florida started with the Palm Beach Post. I was a reporter at the Palm Beach Post, and it started pretty soon after some residents in the Glades region, which is this region with about 30,000 people who live in communities among 400,000 acres of sugarcane that's harvested in Florida. It's Florida is the largest producer of cane sugar in the country, among other states that also produce cane sugar. And essentially, these residents had filed a lawsuit seeking class action status, saying that the practice of harvesting sugarcane had impacted their health and well-being, and specifically because sugarcane is burned before harvest. And it was something that I personally wasn't aware of. as a practice. I knew that we produced a ton of sugar. I knew that this was a huge, that two of the largest sugar producing companies in the country were based in Florida. But I didn't really know the details of how sugar was produced and what that impact looked like until we started to look at the lawsuit. And in 2021, we partnered with ProPublica's local reporting network to really dive into the question of how clean is the air, because the sugar companies essentially were allowed to burn sugarcane with very few regulations. And again, the claim was that residents were getting sick from the impact. And we found something very interesting early on, which was a rule within the Department of Agriculture, with the State Department of Agriculture that oversees the production of sugarcane. And they essentially barred sugarcane burning when the wind is blowing east toward the coast, toward the wealthier and whiter communities, whereas the makeup of the communities that live among the cane fields and west of them are mostly minority, low income. It's a very rural area. And that raised a huge environmental justice question of why ban burning when wind is blowing toward one community, but not when it's blowing toward another or outright. And so we kind of approached it from that with a really community-driven reporting tactics. We just wanted to get a good understanding of what it was like on the ground level, what people were experiencing.
Okay. Thanks for that. So Nadia, do you want to step in? I guess I can say you probably, having reported on the burning practice in Brazil that was changed, could possibly explain a little bit more to viewers why do people do that? Why is it harvested that way to begin with? And what is achieved by doing it that way? And how did Brazil decide that there was another way or a better way?
Sure. So we traveled to São Paulo state, which is the state that produces the most sugarcane in Brazil. And Brazil is the world's largest producer of sugarcane. And the difference in scale between Brazil and the US is really extraordinary. Brazil is farming more than 20 times the land as in the US, and they're producing both cane sugar and ethanol for fuel. So it's as well as electricity based on the residues from the sugarcane plant. So it is a different picture in terms of scale. But what really drove us was after Lulu had done this incredible reporting, looking at what was happening in the communities where sugarcane was being burned in Florida. And as a part of that reporting, she had surfaced that in Brazil, practices were different. We got interested. And so as we're looking specifically at São Paulo state, we saw that they passed a law phasing out the burns, setting a timeline to phase out the burns in sugarcane production back in 2002, so almost 20 years ago. And what's more, the sugarcane industry was working with the government to speed up the timeline. So they actually entered into a series of roundtable talks that resulted in a voluntary agreement a few years after the law was passed, saying they wanted to move up the deadline to get rid of the burns. And so that seemed extraordinary and very different from what we were seeing in Florida. And we wanted to understand, what's that about? Why is the industry on board with ending the burns? And so to answer your question about why they burn, in Brazil, the burns were very specifically introduced because manual laborers were going out and cutting the sugarcane. And this is a practice that persisted and still persists in some parts of Brazil. But the burning was meant to clear the path in the cane field. So when you burn, what burns are these dry outer leaves of the sugarcane stalk. And those leaves can be really sharp. There can be insects or small animals hiding in them. So there were issues of worker safety in terms of them getting bitten. Burning also made it a lot easier for them to physically maneuver in the fields. And that was good for both the manual cane cutters, who were getting paid according to how much they harvested, and the sugar companies. They wanted it to be cut faster. So that was sort of the genesis of burns in Brazil. But over time, as the industry expanded, there was also a lot of pushback. People didn't like that black snow, that soot falling on their homes. People, were finding long lines when they went to the public health clinic during the burning season because they were having issues with asthma or bronchitis or other respiratory issues. And so as the industry expanded, especially as the market grew for ethanol, there became more and more pressure in Brazil to reconsider burning. And so the process in Brazil, unlike in Florida, so in Florida, they already have mechanized harvesting. They had already invested in equipment. So, there aren't manual cane cutters out there in the fields in Florida. And that was a change that took place earlier there. Whereas in Brazil, people were both cutting manually and they were burning to facilitate that cutting. So mechanization was seen not only as sort of the future of harvesting in terms of how quickly a machine can harvest versus human beings, but also that once you put the person inside a machine instead of out in the fields, you no longer have this need to protect them from those sharp leaves, so you don't need to burn anymore. And so they were able to sort of address the environmental concerns which were being raised at the same time. So for the sugar industry in Brazil, it was a double transition. It was mechanization and stopping burning pretty much all at once.
Okay, so let me just pause for a moment to say this. I'm somewhat editorializing. The sugar industry has been around for centuries, and my guess is that the labor intensive harvesting was performed by slaves at one point. And the fact that those folks that live close to the sugarcane fields, many of them presumably are employed in the sugarcane business, not all of them, but those are the folks that are doing the heavy and the hard work. So is that a fair statement for the most part? And maybe Lulu, you're better equipped to handle that question.
Nadia, do you want to jump in on this too? I think yes, but if you want to expound.
Sure. So historically, I mean, you can't separate the history of sugarcane from the history of colonial expansion in the Americas. Sugarcane was the crop that was being sent basically originally to royalty. It was so precious in the 1500s and 1600s that it was really reaching the tables of the most elite in Europe. And as it got bigger and bigger, it became a staple product, an international commodity that was highly valued. But yeah, for hundreds of years, enslaved people were being forced to do this really backbreaking labor in hot fields of cutting cane. And that's absolutely true in Brazil. It's true in the United States and many countries around the Caribbean and in Central and South America. So it is very much a crop. You can't separate the history of sugarcane from that legacy of using forced labor, the labor of enslaved people. Lulu knows better perhaps the history of Florida, but I think everywhere that sugar is grown, you may have people, who have ancestral roots to others who were enslaved, who are working in the industry. And certainly in Brazil, with respect to the manual cutting, it's a job. It requires incredible physical labor and fortitude to be out in incredibly high temperatures, wrapped up, protecting your body from that sun, but you don't need a formal education to perform it. And so it's definitely a job that historically has been done by people often migrating from the northeast of Brazil, which is one of the poorest regions, into Sao Paulo during the cutting season, and staying for a few months and coming back every year to do that work, because there were not enough people to do it in the southeast regions where they grow sugar.
Yeah, and similarly in Florida, it's been historically, it's a crop that's required a lot of migrant labor, and famously the sugar industry would bring in workers from the Caribbean for cane season before they mechanized harvesting, especially because a lot of that was harvested by hand, just like you're hearing about with Brazil, which made the transition a little later, it seems. But Yes, they would bring in migrant workers, and once it was fully mechanized, it was also a lot of workers who live in the region. This is the sugar companies are the largest employers in the Glades region. So this is a community that relies very heavily on the industry for jobs. And that's a huge dynamic in play as this lawsuit moves forward, as people show their support or show that they're against any kind of end to sugarcane burning as a harvest practice.
Okay, so again, I think the reasons why you two have been involved in reporting on this issue do address or do touch on just directly agricultural injustice. And that's a topic that we could talk about in a number of fronts. But the fact of the matter is, everybody who likes sugar doesn't think about, well, where did this come from and how did it get to my table? They don't think about the efforts that are associated with the harvesting and the requirements for doing the physical heavy work and the work that's dangerous and the work that exposes people to potential toxins in the air fall more on people of color. And to the extent that that issue doesn't resonate, it's because those people can be easily ignored. I think one of you mentioned, and maybe it was you, Lulu, that and Nadia, but not Nadia, I know you can address this. In Brazil, at least one of the reasons why Brazil felt that it was politically appropriate for them to address the issue of getting rid of burning was because it wasn't just the workers in the sugarcane fields, and it wasn't just the folks that lived temporarily in the area. The the dynamics of how the ash was spread went into richer communities and people presumably whose interests are more important to politicians. But in Florida, for whatever reason, it seems like you don't have the same demographic dynamic. So I'd like each of you to weigh in on that. But before I do, let me let my listeners know that we're talking about the issue of sugarcane burning, the impact it has on the people that do the work and live in the area. And I'm speaking with Nadia Sussman, who's a video journalist at ProPublica and who has written at least one or more articles on this topic, particularly from the vantage point of Brazil, and Lulu Ramadan, who is also a investigative reporter with the Seattle Times and a fellow with the ProPublica network, who has talked about the problem, including legal issues in a case which we're going to talk about in a moment, in the Glades area of Florida, which is not too far away from Palm Beach, West Palm, but apparently far enough away that the country clubbers and the folks that go to Mar-a-Lago are not experiencing the pain. So in any event, getting back to my question about the impacts of how this burning affects people in Florida versus how it affected people in Brazil as being one of the reasons why Brazil was able to take the action it took and why Florida has been resistant to it. So who wants to start?
I can jump in and tell you a little bit about Brazil. So basically, just to set the context, Sao Paulo is an incredibly populous state. There's the city Sao Paulo, which has a huge metro region, but there are all these cities in the interior of the state where sugarcane is grown and expanded over the last 20 years. And those interior cities are substantial, hundreds of thousands of people, sometimes approaching 1 million. And so collectively, the state has more than 40 million people. During the sugarcane burning season, millions and millions of people were feeling the effects of this. And there are entire cities that are surrounded by sugarcane fields in every direction. So when they were burning, a broad cross-section of people were being affected, and the soot from the sugarcane burning travels, as does the particulate matter, which is much finer and which you can't see, but it can travel for kilometers depending on wind conditions. So long story short, it was widely unpopular. People complained of the smell, they complained of the ash falling on their homes. In Brazil, it is very common to dry your laundry on a line outside. So imagine for 6 months of the year, every time you do your laundry and you hang it up to dry, it's getting stained by black soot and you're having to rewash, sometimes in areas that don't have a lot of water. So there are actually added costs associated with it. So citizen complaints increased and increased. There was just general political pressure. And then in addition to that, there was pressure from environmentalists because you have these massive open burns releasing smoke and pollutants into the air. You have the medical community, which is going on the news and talking about the seasonal effects that they were seeing during the burns of respiratory health, where especially for children and the elderly, they were seeing increased reports of, both incidents of disease and also hospitalization and mortality, during the sugarcane burning season. So there was pressure coming from all these different fronts. And, already in the early 2000s, they were ready to make a legislative change that, again, was followed by agreements that were brokered with industry to actually implement the changes.
So, Lulu, it's not the same in Florida. You don't have the same demographics, you don't have the same dynamics, and we'll get into some of the other reasons why things haven't changed, because this problem with burning of cane fields and the resultant dissemination of ash and toxic particles has been discussed, at least for a long time, and yet nothing significantly positive has happened. How is your reporting focused on that and the reasons behind it?
Yeah, so the context in Florida is that the sugarcane is grown in this sort of south central region, right around the Lake Okeechobee. And the reason being is the soil, because of the soil is it's muck. It's this really nutrient rich soil that it's just a natural, good for sugarcane to flourish. And that is about 40 miles from the coast. And in the 1980s and 1990s, as Palm Beach County started to grow and suburban communities started to pop up closer and closer to that central part of the county that divided the agricultural region from the suburban and urban areas. You had more communities popping up that were starting to experience the impacts of sugarcane burning. And in the 90s in particular, one of the communities that is closest to the sugarcane fields now to this day started to grow out, and complaints started to roll in. There were dozens of complaints to the Department of Agriculture about sugarcane burning. And the dynamics of this community, it's a largely white, wealthier community, the village of Wellington, Florida, where you had a lot of large properties, and obviously the makeup of the community was very different from that of the Glades. And when Wellington residents complained, the Department of Agriculture passed rules that changed when sugar companies could burn. So those impacts have been significantly lessened on eastern communities in Florida since the 1990s, because they do not burn sugarcane when the wind is blowing directly east. So you're less likely, you do still, in some cases, you smell sugarcane burning. We've heard from people in some of the coastal communities on occasion, but certainly not as deeply as the people in the Glades experience it. So that's kind of why you're less likely to perhaps know about sugarcane burning or experience it, smell it, see ash when you live on one side of the community and not the other.
Shocking, it seems to me. How convenient for the wealthy white urban and suburbanites to be able to attack a problem which has a significant effect on the people in the immediate surroundings by simply restricting the time in which the burning can happen, so to coordinate with which way the wind is blowing, which is a metaphor obviously for a lot of things. And it, it sort of reminds me of, we got an immigration problem, how do you handle it? Throw up a wall. Okay, you have a pollution and health problem, but the way to handle that is to just simply change the rules about when burning occurs, so it doesn't affect people who housing prices might go down, or who might otherwise complain about ash falling on their terracotta roofs. So so I don't want to be too political here, but that strikes me as sort of a strange way of approaching it. And it feeds into sort of the larger question I have, which is this. There are environmental laws in this country that have not been decimated by the former Trump administration yet. We have the Clean Air Act, and we have state environmental laws. You have a Department of Agriculture in Florida, but you also have a state equivalent of the EPA. So if you approach this not as an agricultural issue, but as a health issue, you would think that without even the need to file a lawsuit, that the health authorities would pay attention to it. You have a very large healthcare community, not just of patients, but also of university hospitals and medical establishments and research institutions. You would think that those folks could complain and be heard, both at the state and federal level. But apparently, while that may have happened, it hasn't produced any tangible results thus far. Is that a fair statement? Who wants to jump in on that?
Yes. There haven't been many changes, to answer that question,
but what I'm saying is there haven't, and again, it's not I'm just trying to sort of understand. If you burn things and you produce ash, it seems fundamental and obvious to me that people who may be prone to respiratory illnesses, including COVID, just as an example, but people who have COPD and asthma, we know, and I know at least, that when the wildfires were burning in the West, we felt it here on the East Coast. If there's a lot of pollution of various sources, including presumably burning, the health authorities come on the radio and television stations, and they advise people to stay in their homes. Don't go out. Don't do exercise outdoors. Avoid this and that, and people that are particularly susceptible to it. So again, it would seem to me that sort of thing would be happening in Florida and would resonate, and it would get to the bureaucrats that work for the Florida Department or Environmental Protection Agency. It would, get to legislators, perhaps. Might even get to the governor, DeSantis, but it doesn't seem to be happening.
Right. So it's definitely health issues and environmental impacts. Those issues have been raised by people in the Glades for years, and there have been the Department of Health has carried out. We reported on a few studies that had been carried out by the Palm Beach County Department of Health, which is just the county health department that falls under the state health department, on the environmental impacts and air quality impacts of sugarcane burning. And one of those studies in particular had recommended a health impact assessment, but the department did not carry that out. They did not follow that recommendation. And one of the reasons we don't exactly know what that impact is like in the Glades is because nobody has really carried out any sort of formal assessment of health trends in the region. So the background on our reporting, the Palm Beach Post and ProPublica, in an effort to fill some of the information gaps that existed, that include air quality monitoring after we found that there was insufficient monitoring in the region, and no health monitoring. we decided to partner with people in the community and academics to address that. And we put out low-cost air sensors in the community during a sugarcane burning season so that we could measure particulate matter and get a better understanding of what the air quality trends actually are like. And it was a sort of unprecedented step because nobody had really gone out there despite years of complaints, despite years of asking for some sort of formal assessment of the impact of this practice. So we went out under the advice and guidance of academics from across the country who do this for a living and use these exact sensors in their research. And then we also assessed health data, hospitalization and emergency room admissions data. Now, because we are not academics and we are not state employees, we're very limited in what we can access as journalists. We were not able to get daily hospitalization data from the state. That limited our ability to track health trends the way academics ideally would. But we did an assessment that was more of an ecological assessment where we looked at what the health and hospitalization trends were like for Glades communities compared to other communities that were similar in all sorts of demographics that are really key when you're comparing to different bodies. For example, what does the community look like? Is it urban or is it rural? The racial and gender and income demographics of an area. And we found that there were that Glades residents had experienced hospitalization and emergency room rates at a higher. Essentially, they were hospitalized and sent to the emergency or went to the emergency room at higher rates than other similar areas and demographics in Florida. And that was enough of an indicator that academics said someone needs to come in and do that full assessment. People who have access to that data, which is, again, the state and academics when they're allowed that access by the state. So really, to answer your question, nobody has stepped in and assess this formally as an environmental or health potential problem at the state level. And for that reason, that gap in information has just lingered. And so we
lingered like the soot in the air, so to speak. Okay. Well, let me, Nadia, you're welcome to step in, but let me just mention one thing just for clarity. We talked before we went on air about the monitor issue. Let's just be crystal clear here. You indicated that there was one monitor that the state had put up, and it wasn't even working all the time. And so again, it sort of begs the question, if you don't have a monitor to monitor how much of this particulate is in the atmosphere, then you're not going to be able to provide any meaningful information to the agency or make any reasonable decisions about what kinds of steps need to be taken to address the issue. Am I correct in that?
I think so. To jump in a little bit, and Lulu will be able to speak to this finally, but yes, there was one monitor and it was not considered fine enough in its readings to be used for EPA's, for Clean Air Act enforcement. So one monitor, again, for an area of roughly 400,000 acres where sugarcane is grown. Additionally, it's important to note that it was doing 24-hour averages. And again, Lulu can talk more about the sensors they use, but I think one of the big differences is that when you're averaging out air pollution over the course of 24 hours and sugarcane burning, it's these very short controlled burns. It's these bursts, lasting 20 to 40 minutes where a truck is going through and setting fire and then quickly extinguishing those fires. By having this 24-hour average, you lose the ability to see when there are these short-term pollution spikes. And so the project of putting air sensors around the glades with residents was precisely to be able to measure in much shorter intervals of 10 minutes as opposed to the 24-hour standard. But Lulu, you can probably say more about that.
Well, Lulu, before you respond, and let me just ask, is there a sort of baseline under the Clean Air Act or some other environmental regulation, federal or state, that says you can't have more than so many parts per million of ash or whatever the toxins are associated with burning. You have to bring it down to a certain level. So like comparing it to a smokestack company that puts stuff into the atmosphere, but there's ways of there's baseline standards, and then there's measurements to determine whether or not the companies that are responsible for that are adhering to those standards. Isn't there anything like that with respect to this issue in the United States, or in Florida in particular?
Yes, yes. The EPA monitors. So particulate matter is a byproduct of combustion, and that is the main air toxin that the EPA is monitoring as it relates to sugarcane burning. And it's a mixture of air pollutants that's captured by this one category of particulate matter. But essentially, yes, there are levels that you shouldn't surpass. But like Nadia said, that type of pollutant is measured in 24-hour and 1 year increments only. So those are averages over 24 hours. And the reason for that, according to academics and people who work for the EPA and are familiar with this, is that you don't want to police individual incidents, like a house fire, for instance. A house fire, you can't control that amount of pollution from that level of combustion in a short amount of time gets released into the air. Not every time there's an uncontrolled fire, you don't want to have an EPA violation or a Clean Air Act violation. The point is to look at long-term pollution, but what it fails to capture when you're looking at 24-hour and 1 year averages is this type of reoccurring pollution that falls in this very, very unique category where you have sugarcane burning for a short period of time, this small window during the day, and in short bursts, where when they're measuring that over the course of 24 hours, it's natural that any spikes would be tempered over an average of that long. So if you're only burning for 8 or 9 hours a day and sporadically across a region, you're really not capturing the exact impact of that. And questions have been raised about, the sufficiency of that type of air pollution monitoring, as well as whether or not we should be looking at, and experts did say that we should be looking more closely at this specific type of pollution and measuring it in a different way so that you're fully capturing the impact. Because research continues to emerge regularly about the short-term impacts of particulate matter exposure, the same way they do with other pollutants measured by the Clean Air Act. Sulfur dioxide is a really good example. We used to measure that in 24-hour averages. The EPA now measures that in 5-minute averages, because research has since come out showing that even 5 minutes of elevated exposure to sulfur dioxide can be harmful to your health. So as we start to learn more, that the EPA right now under the Biden administration is reconsidering its particulate matter. It's the levels essentially that they're enforcing under the Clean Air Act.
Okay, well, it would appear again that the wheels of regulatory change to respond to a probable problem, like as the one we're discussing, are grinding slowly. As you suggest. I mean, there's worlds of difference between holding a homeowner accountable for a fire that he or she presumably didn't set, and saying your house, one of the consequences of your house being on fire is that you put pollution in the air, so we're going to come after you for that. And talking about that against a planned agricultural process that takes place every year for, I think, 4 or 5 months or longer than that, from, is it April to October? That's
the harvest season is actually October through March, and then March. Often extended into April and May.
So several months, and it's planned. It's not negligent. It's not active nature. We're doing it, and we're doing it to facilitate a presumably a lower cost method of harvesting something that people want to put in their coffee. That just seems like worlds of difference. And you would think, again, or at least we would hope, that the regulatory agencies and the health authorities would respond to that with more meaningful standards such as you mentioned with the sulfur dioxide example. So again, Nadia, let me just refocus the question to you. And again, let me let people know that are tuning in or have been tuning in. I'm speaking with two distinguished journalists, Nadia Sussman, who's a video journalist for ProPublica, and Lulu Ramadan, who's also with ProPublica, but is also an investigative reporter with the Seattle Times. And we're talking about, as I mentioned at the top of the show, a burning issue, namely the burning of sugarcane fields to facilitate the harvesting of the sugarcane product and the negative consequences associated with that on the people that reside in the area, and many of whom who work in the sugarcane fields, and the apparent inability to get really meaningful regulatory change, and also to get a resolution. But I take it, Nadia, that the need to have these monitors and to, measure and go through all kinds of scientific loops was not required in Brazil. They just recognized that there was a problem and they decided to attack it from a pragmatic standpoint.
To be sure, there's rigorous monitoring in Brazil as well, that the state environmental agencies in Brazil are monitoring air quality all the time. And additionally, when there was burning in Brazil, São Paulo state, and I should say that there's still authorized burns in some other states of Brazil and even a tiny amount in São Paulo, but it's regulated. People have to apply for a permit to burn from the state authorities. And so I would not say that there isn't, similar monitoring. However, I think there was more of a confluence of factors where it became in the interest of various parties. Everybody agreed essentially that mechanization needed to happen. It was in the interest of people who were experiencing the effects of burning, whether it was the soot falling or the health effects. As I said, there were campaigns by environmentalists looking at the issue of emissions and greenhouse gases. But then additionally, from the perspective of the sugar companies, there were advantages to mechanization. And so they were able to make the leap to not burning all at once. And also remember that while in the US, sugar companies are using the cane plant to produce cane sugar for a domestic market, in Brazil, they're doing a dance between producing sugar, which is sold domestically and internationally, and producing ethanol, which is used as a fuel, largely domestically, but also marketed internationally. And so for them, for example, when they were still using manual cutting and widespread burns, people talked to us about sort of the appearance in the market of trying to sell a lower impact fuel, a greener fuel that's being produced with people doing this backbreaking labor that some NGOs were calling analogous to slave labor and burning large amounts of land. It wasn't a good look, basically. And the sugar companies recognized that. So they wanted to have, to be able to show that they were using modern techniques that didn't involve these big open burns. And so I think first there was the legislation. The government decided that there was enough risk to health and environment that they wanted to change the rules. But once that legislation was in place, once the change was going to happen, then the sugar companies wanted to actually accelerate the change, in part, as one person said, it wasn't good for them to have a mixed system of manual cutting and mechanical cutting, because everything changes when you mechanize. You have to change the way you plant your fields. You have to change, sort of everything that happens from the beginning of the plant until the final product at the end in the mills, which in Brazil, many of them are producing sugar and ethanol, as well as the electricity they're generating from leftover plant materials. So I think the change was seen as much more inevitable. It was more broadly embraced. It would make the sugar companies, it would reduce complaints against the sugar companies not to be burning because people didn't like the burns. And if you talk to people in Brazil, I think one big difference we found is just sort of a broad acknowledgement within the industry that people didn't like it. And a broad acknowledgement these days, that sure, it might be cheaper, but it's just not environmentally correct to have these burns. And that's more widely acknowledged, I think. There's no dispute over that. And if you speak to people, for example, we spoke to the technical director of Unica, which is a big association of Brazilian sugar producers and mills. And sort of the phrase that keeps coming up is, there's no one going back. We never go back. In Brazil, they adapted around the practice of not burning in a way that's incredibly agronomically beneficial, agriculturally beneficial. So they're protecting their soils, they're retaining water. And basically farmers like what's happened now that they've been through the whole transition. Farmers and sugar producers like what's going on their land, the productivity they're seeing, their ability to cut back on the use of some, herbicides, for example, the fact that they don't have to wash the sugar cane before they're processing it in the mill, so it drastically reduces water usage. And I should say that in Brazil, sugarcane is grown in a lot of really dry regions, so that's significant. So it's sort of full steam ahead, and at this point, in terms of measuring the amount of land that's burned, and again, Sao Paulo state is a unique example. It's the state that changed the practices soonest and also grows the largest amount of sugarcane. But for the 2020-2021 growing season and harvesting season, they authorized burns at this point on less than 1% of the land that they're farming. So more than 99% was being harvested without prescribed burns.
Okay, so let me go back then to what is going on then in Florida. What is the difference? What's the problem with those Florida sugarcane companies? What's the problem with the local politics? So let me just get a little down and dirty here. You have a learning experience that would not be difficult to build upon, presumably in Florida. You mentioned, Lulu, earlier that the mechanisms or the machines or whatever that would be used as a substitute for the burning are certainly available. But apparently what's happened is intransigent resistance on the part of the well-funded, moneyed sugarcane industry and the association. And they talk in terms of jobs. We don't want to lose the jobs for the sugarcane business industry. Nobody presumably is talking about breaking the back of the sugarcane industry or throwing people out of work. But nonetheless, they're able to get some traction on that issue. And then we have something in Florida, apparently, called the Right to Farm Act, which is an interesting title for a statute, I think, the Right to Farm, which was amended recently based upon what we talked about earlier, Lulu, to, in effect, stymie, prohibit, deter people suing individuals or collective groups, suing agricultural businesses, farmers, that those poor farmers, like the 2 or 3 family farm that doesn't exist anymore, but suing farmers, God forbid, for a nuisance because of the smell of manure or whatever. That statute has been used and is being used to say, you can't come after us for a nuisance, which again sounds really crazy. But before you respond and help correct the record here, again, let me announce that we're talking to Lulu Ramadan, who's a reporter, an investigative reporter with the Seattle Times, and also a fellow with ProPublica's reporting network. And we're talking with Nadia Sussman, who's a video journalist at ProPublica, about why we can't do things in this country as well as they can in Brazil when there's a major health and environmental threat.
So to answer your question about the Right to Farm Act, it's actually, that is really standard language. They actually have that in for your homegrown listeners in North Carolina as well. So that act is actually pretty standard. Most states have some sort of Right to Farm Act and a version of protection of farmers from encroaching suburban neighborhoods. So the idea is to protect farmers from being sued when their practice essentially outdates new development. So why build a home next to a farm when you know that that nuisance is going to exist, and allow the homeowner to sue the farmer and put them out of business? But the way it was applied in Florida and has been applied, it is a broad protection for agricultural industries. But in this case, as this legal battle is unfolding between the Glades residents who are suing, seeking class action status over sugarcane burning practices, and the sugar companies, as that's unfolding in court, state lawmakers take up an amendment to the Right to Farm Act in Florida. They want to include essentially particle emissions as a list of nuisances that are now a protected action. That is very new. That's something that hasn't existed in Florida state law, and it applies very specifically to, remember, particle emissions, particulate matter is a byproduct of combustion. So this only applies to crops that require burning. And the largest field crop in Florida that is burned is sugarcane. So it raised a lot of red flags for people who went up to Tallahassee and said, this sounds like you're just trying to stop us from suing sugar companies over burning. There was a lot of back and forth where lawmakers were like, that's not the intention here. It's really just to expand protections for farmers, and we need to protect our farmers. And it did pass. So it's now ingrained in Florida state law that there is a bill right now that is seeking to strip that language from state law. So it's going to be a back and forth for a while, it seems. But the point being that as this lawsuit's unfolding, a really key aspect of it is the question of how clean is the air. And, the class action suit is raising questions about the monitoring, the sufficiency of monitoring in the region, health, the lack of health trend monitoring, and a lack of data that has kind of afforded this level of protection against criticism of the practice. Because when someone says this is harming us, state lawmakers themselves said, show me the proof when they were taking up this bill. One lawmaker in particular said, you say that it's making people sick and that it's, polluting the air. Where's the evidence of that? And the fact is that evidence just does not exist because the state has not taken that up, despite its own recommendations internally in 2016 to carry out a sophisticated health assessment.
So let me speak to that for a second and ask you a follow-up question. The state could do the research of the health effects, and again, that would be independent of using monitoring data, but would be parallel to it. They haven't. Question is, why haven't they? Not important, don't have the funding, have other things to do with their time, or have been leaned on by lobbyists who are lobbying the agency. We can speculate, but we don't know. But there are plenty of healthcare organizations and hospitals and university medical centers that are concerned about respiratory issues and the health of patients and people who have comorbidities. Why couldn't they jump in, and why couldn't they do their own research and then submit that? Why can't those folks march down to the State House in Tallahassee, or march up to the State House and say, we need to have an investigation into the health and environmental effects of this, independent of what the Florida Department of Health is not doing?
I think that's a great question. They have since our reporting. Academics from across the country have come together, sought grant funding so that they could assess this. So one of the reasons is that this doesn't just happen out of a void, is that academics need some sort of indication in order to get the funding that's necessary to research everything, absolutely every topic imaginable that they're out researching right now. They can't just pick a topic of interest to them and say, I want to spend $1 million looking at that issue. The money has to come from grants from the federal government, from the state, from agencies, from contracts, or from donations. And so in this vein, there was no simple indication that told them this is worth investing the money. And as soon as we carried out what academics have called a cursory assessment, we looked at the health trends, and one academic put it this way: this would have been a very simple step for one epidemiologist to do within the State Department of Health. The thing we did, which was looking at an ecological look at health trends in the Glades region. We are not academics. We did this under the guidance of academics, but they said that could have been an easy step that could have given them an indication. Should we pursue this further? Do we need to go seek out more money and put more effort into this? And the results showed to academics, they said that yes, it is worthy of looking at more closely. And so now you have academics who helped us with our air quality monitoring effort, who are partnering, who got grant funding from NASA to assess this. And they're using that funding now to deploy more air monitors similar to what we did. But imagine flooding the entire region with these monitors, where we were only limited to the amount we could afford as journalists, news organizations. And they're out there assessing health impacts. They're looking at the trends and they're looking at the pollution measurements from sugarcane burning. So now that they've taken it up, but that is again independent of the state, where these recommendations originated, where the regulations originate. There is only one body that is responsible solely for sugarcane, for regulating sugarcane burning, and that is the Department of Agriculture. You mentioned before the governor's office. The fact is there are checks and balances in place in Florida, and the only agency that is able to change this practice, whether to regulate it further or ban it outright, is the Department of Agriculture, overseen by an elected official, the commissioner, the agricultural commissioner, which right now is Nikki Fried. And but that is an elected position, and that is that entire agency is solely responsible for this practice in Florida.
Okay, and of course it's called the Department of Agriculture. So of course their main mission is to protect agriculture. But it does seem from everything that you and Nadia have been talking about is what we're really talking about in terms of remediation is remediating a health issue. The agricultural impact of it is saying, we know there's a health issue, people are negatively and adversely impacted. And presumably, I'm betting Nadia could point us to studies that were done epidemiologically in Brazil that are potentially transferable. It's not like there's anything particularly new. Either imbibing ash is a problem or it's not a problem. Obviously, the more ash you get, the worse it is. But still, but it just seems, it's tied up in an agency which is not necessarily incented to do it. So you got this lawsuit going on, and the lawsuit has been pending for some time, and the defendants, representing the sugarcane industry and the associations presumably, are fighting tooth and nail to try to knock the thing out of court. And so, it'll either continue to get tied up, or it will get knocked out, or there will be a hearing on the matter. Do you have any kind of a read on this from what you're doing, Lulu, as to where this is going and how soon? And we only have a minute or so to talk about it, so just be brief.
The short answer is it's really difficult to tell. We've just got to let it play out in court. And again, though, the Glades residents are making they're trying to make the strongest case possible as to why this should move forward. And in the motion to dismiss filed by the sugar companies, it's really important to note that they cite this one air monitor that we've discussed pretty at length in this conversation. They cite this one air monitor as showing that the air is good, clean, healthy. And we've pointed out with our reporting that there is a flaw in that logic, that the monitor itself, the EPA even acknowledged that the monitor is not fit to assess whether the air is in compliance with the Clean Air Act. And that is the only federal law aimed at telling you whether the air is actually healthy enough that it's not a violation. So
all right, good. Well, listen, I'm sorry that's going to have to be the last word. This is an interesting topic. Nadia, I didn't give you a chance to have the last word, but I want to thank both of my guests, Nadia Sussman and Lulu Ramadan from Politico, to being on the station today. ProPublica, sorry, it's too many P's. ProPublica, thank you so much. We'll have you on again to talk about this further.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
thank you.